Up to today, I have only ever met one hunger striker. At a debate in DCU when I was a fairly old student out there, having had a career in manual things, and I decided I better start using my head instead of my body. I went to DCU and there was a debate one night with, on the one side, Prunchius de Rossa and Austin Curry, and on the other side, a man who had been on hunger strike for 42 days. And the debate was around the budding peace process and other matters. And this man wiped the floor with de Rossa and Curry. And he did it without ever raising his voice. He did it with a quiet dignity and an integrity that his struggle had given him. After the debate, where he had won over a student audience, most of whom had only been 5 or 6 years of age when the hunger strikes happened in 1981. He had won them over completely, and I went up and I just had a word with him, and he was a lovely man. He was a good-humoured, quiet, decent man with very evident commitment to Republican principles. And I hope to meet him again. But a year later, Pat McKeown had died. And Pat had died as a result of organ failure brought on by the hunger strike. So that, as Patrick said, we should really remember all of the people who took that decision, because the only way I can imagine it is the way I imagined it in 1991, when this state refused to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the revolution. And on April the 24th that year, I was driving up in Churchtown in Dublin, and I can remember the road I was on, and I pulled over and I was angry. I started to think about what this insult was. And I started to imagine my own grandfather in 1916 when he had to walk away from his family to go to Boland's Mills. And how that moment must have been a moment where you decide whether you're going to cross the threshold or not. It doesn't matter how much you've thought about what you're going to do in advance, there is a moment where you have to cross the threshold. And I was thinking about the hunger strikes, obviously, in the last couple of weeks, and I imagine, without knowing, but I imagine that there is that moment as well, that no matter how committed you feel you are, that there is a moment when that greatest act of courage must take place. You know, thinking back on Pat McKeown, I think that for him, there must have been that moment where you make that final decision that, yes, I am going ahead with this. So if I can just refer to these, because I want to run through the list of heroes. I don't want to call them martyrs. So Thomas Ashe in 1917, force feeding, and I'll come back to force feeding later on, which to me is effectively murder. The manner of Ashe's death to me is murder. Terence McSweeney, and then we think of these big names, Thomas Ashe, Terence McSweeney, and we're inclined not to think so much of Joe Murphy and Michael Fitzgerald in the same year in Brixton. But all of these are equals. I'm a great believer in the idea that we are all citizens, none above and none below. So for me, Joe Murphy and Michael Fitzgerald are in that pantheon of heroes. In 1923, there were 12,000 Republican prisoners in Free State custody. 8,000 of them went on hunger strike, men and women. 8,000. 3 died: Denny Barry, Andrew O'Sullivan, and Joseph Whitty. So that's the British and then the Free State that would countenance the idea of men or women being forced to go on hunger strike to achieve what we should consider to be basic human rights. and basic dignity. So with De Valera and Fianna Fáil it would be different. Well, actually it wouldn't be different. Following the roundup of Republicans and internment during the so-called emergency, there were three names that came to me. Tony Darcy died on April the 16th, 1940, and then 3 days later Sean McNeill, or Jack McNeill, died after 55 days on hunger strike in Arbour Hill. And if you think about the irony of it, he died in Arbour Hill, a few yards away from the graves of the executed men of 1916, and under the watch of the only surviving commandant of 1916. There's some terrible irony in that. In 1941, Republican Sean McCaughey began a life sentence in Portlaoise, and I didn't know this about him until I did a bit of research. He spent 5 years on the blanket. 5 years. I thought the blanket protest, in my ignorance, I thought the blanket process was a late 70s, early 80s thing. But McCaughey was 5 years naked except for a blanket, and then went on hunger strike, and after 10 days refused water and died 13 days later. And nobody in Ireland talks about these people other than Republicans. You know, the British and the Americans and the French and all of these parade their history in front of their people as a way of binding the nation together and so on. And what we do in this country is we elect a fellow like Rory Quinn, who will take history off the school curriculum as a compulsory subject and make it optional. It's now optional in this banana non-republic that young people will learn any element of their history. There are girls who will go into Golden Bridge School, I know this for a fact, they'll go into Golden Bridge School up in Inchicore in the shadow of Kilmainham this year, this September, in first year, and they will come out in sixth year without ever having had a history class, thanks to Rory Quinn. Another one then is the executions as well of George Plant and Charlie Cairns. Charlie Cairns was hanged, George Plant was shot. But to the best of my knowledge, it was an English hangman that was brought over to hang Charlie Cairns. And this is under De Valera's watch, again. In 1974, Michael McGahan, we all know that story. He was shifted around from prison to prison, and eventually died of forced feeding, not directly of the forced feeding, but the damage caused to him by medics, by doctors. And doctors have always, unfortunately, been found to support the role of British military. His weight had dropped from 12 stone to 6 stone, and he had been force-fed 17 times. Again, forced feed. And then Frank Stagg, 62 days in Wakefield prison. Ironically, that's the prison that my grandfather passed through on his way to Frongo, Wakefield, so it had history and resonance. But we know what happened to Frank Stagg in his dying and also in his death, that an Irish government would kidnap the body of a hunger striker and concrete over it. But they didn't succeed, as we know. The body was reinterred in the Republican plot. All of these were young, or relatively young men. And we had Humphrey Atkinson, who was the British Secretary of State, among others, talking about suicide, talking about these people made their own choice. And it was free will. And the suicide word was taken up again in this country by a certain element of people in this country. The notion that these men were interested in suicide, not in living, not in seeing the Ireland that they hoped would exist as a result of their commitment. These were typical weasel words, and those of us who live in the 26 counties know that these words come fast and furious from the political class. Weasel words. Humphrey Atkins said, if Mr. Sands persisted in his wish to commit suicide, that was his choice. And I regret this needless and pointless death. It was self-inflicted. But the use of hunger strikes, when we think of it, when I think of it, if somebody says hunger strikes to me, I think of 1981, I think of Thomas Ashe and Terence McSweeney. But it goes much further back than that. It's not necessarily a Republican tool. It goes back, as far as we know, it goes back into the Brehon Law period, 1500 years ago. The idea of the hunger strike, for a person who was wronged, it was encoded in the Brehon Law that they were entitled to go and sit on the doorstep of the person who had wronged them and go on hunger strike until that wrong was corrected. And it goes back even further than that. It goes back to India in exactly the same form in India. Now, there is a strain of the Irish that is descended in all of us from the Indian people. So it is likely that the tradition of the hunger strike was brought to Ireland from the subcontinent of India 2,500 years ago. And I just wanted, before I finish, just to mention the campaigns for solidarity, which the 1981 campaign really relied on. So did the 1917 campaign and the 1920 campaign. It was for solidarity, not just in Ireland, but for international solidarity. And Terence McSweeney wrote, if Ireland is to be regenerated, we must have internal unity. If the world is to be regenerated, we must have worldwide unity, not of government, but of brotherhood. And we must turn to the common origin of the human race, the beauty of the world that is the heritage of all, our common hopes and fears, and the mutual interests of the people of the earth. So McSweeney was not talking to the powerful, he was talking to us. And one of the campaigns that I'm involved in is the campaign for the Palestinian people, for the rights of the Palestinian people, and I know Republicans all over Ireland are involved as well. There's a man called Kader Adnan who went on hunger strike in December 2011 and last 66 days before he forced the Zionist government to release him back to house arrest in his own house, but to accede to his demands. And just a month and a half ago he issued this statement. This is Kader Adnan. I announce my full solidarity with my 30,000 oppressed brothers in the American prisons, and I ask that the American people and the government end the policy of isolation of detainees and the prisoners and comply by human rights law that forbids continuous isolation because of its destructive effects on the mental and physical health of detainees. And I'm sure many of you know, but on July the 8th, 30,000 Californian prisoners went on hunger strike. As of today, at least 94 are still on that hunger strike. That's 45 days continuously. Now they are being force-fed, and the American courts have upheld the right of prison authorities to force-feed. But, you know, these are prisoners who are, many of them may be guilty of the things that they have been condemned for, but they are still entitled to basic human rights and basic levels of dignity and respect as human beings. That's what Terence McSweeney is saying to us. In Guantanamo Bay, there are still 100 unconvicted, have never been tried, men who are lifted from the Middle East, Afghanistan, places like that, and brought to a strange place outside the jurisdiction of the United States so that they couldn't be given a trial. And those men have been on hunger strike as well. There's a woman called Margaret Owen from Dorset in England. She's 81 years of age, who has spent a week on hunger strike in solidarity with those people. That's what we wanted in 1981. And what Terence McSweeney is saying to us from the grave is that that's what we need to do for other oppressed people around the world. There are two names that I want to mention, because as far as I'm concerned, internment still exists in Ireland. Martin Corey and Marion Price should be released, or charged, but should be released. I just want to mention James Connolly and Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. It's 2013, it's the centenary of the lockout, and both of those and others, especially women, used the hunger strike as a way of pressuring prison authorities. And James Connolly wasn't a stranger to hunger strikes. He used it several times. And I'll finish with Bobby Sands. I'm stealing from another speaker, but I think that this quote speaks to me. Anyway, I'm sure it'll speak to you. The very first entry in his prison hunger strike diary. He said, "I am dying not just to attempt to end the barbarity of H-Block or to gain the rightful recognition of a political prisoner, but primarily because what is lost here is lost for the Republic." And I want to say that all of my adult life I haven't had no allegiance to the so-called Republic of Ireland. I have rejected it all of my life. I have only one allegiance, politically, and that is to the Irish Republic. James Connolly talked about the Irish Republic as offering a beacon of hope to the oppressed people of the world. In other words, if we did with the proclamation, with that model for the Republic, what he thought we could do, then that Republic would be a model that other people around the world would use. The Irish Republic. Thanks very much.